The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, and opinions expressed herein, belong to the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of Brigham Young University or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Well, friends, welcome to an evening session of Education Week. My name is Dr. Matthew Gray. I'm a professor of ancient scripture here at Brigham Young University, and I am really excited to be with you for another week worth of series at Education Week. I must say this is my first time teaching a class so late. I always wondered who comes to these late classes, and now I know. So I'm not sure how I got the slot, but it's great to be here, and thank you for being here too. I know it's a real sacrifice to stay this late. I know you're probably exhausted, you're hungry, tired, probably a little bit wet. It's been drizzling, and I know that you're all looking at your clock because you know that Ahsoka streams tonight. So I know I have a watch party with my daughter as soon as I get home at 10 o'clock tonight. So anyway, lots going on. Thank you for taking the time to be here. As I said, I'm really excited to be with you for another series of Education Week classes. This year, as I was thinking about what classes to teach, I thought that it would be really fun to choose two of my favorite texts from the second half of the New Testament and look at those in depth. And the reason was that because we are now currently in the, moving into the second half of the New Testament for our Come Follow Me curriculum, our Sunday school classes, our personal study, and so forth, I just thought it would be a nice time to choose two of my favorite texts. So for this year's Education Week, I'm going to be doing two four-part series on two of my favorite books from the New Testament. The first being in this 7 o'clock hour, looking at the book of 1 Corinthians, and the second being a topic that I've wanted to do for a very long time at Education Week, and that is looking at the book of Revelation. And as some of you may know, my background is in archaeology and the social history of ancient Judaism. I love reading New Testament scripture in its original context, in its Jewish setting, in the context of the larger Roman world. So for both of these series on 1 Corinthians and then on the book of Revelation, my goal, my hope, is just to bring my first century nerdiness to these texts and just look at these things in their historical setting with you. Kind of what does it look like to read these texts as historians, as archaeologists, and as those who are interested in the social history of the earliest Christians as seen in 1 Corinthians and the book of Revelation. So to begin, let's take a look. This first hour, start with the book of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is just a joy of a text for many reasons. Obviously, it's very long and it is complex. Maybe most people don't wake up and say this is a joy of a text, but I really do. I think it's a fascinating text, partially because it is a fascinating insight into the social history, the community dynamics, the lived experiences of the earliest followers of Jesus in a Greek city. And it is so fun to look through the issues that Paul has to deal with, the issues that Paul has to address, the issues that early Christians in that Greek city are wrestling with, are struggling with. And as an archaeologist, it's a really fun text to study because the site of Corinth has been so well excavated that it's just this wonderful intersection of Christian social history, a rich text in this letter of Paul, and the material culture that all allow us a remarkably full picture of what it's like to be a Christian in a Greek city in the first century. So I'm really looking forward to this series. The way I'm going to start this series on 1 Corinthians is I actually wanted to take a step back and just ask questions about Paul himself. As with any text that we read from the scriptures, the more we can know about the author and the original setting of that text, the more you are going to get out of it in your personal study, in your Sunday school classes, or whatever. So let's start this series on 1 Corinthians by looking at Paul himself. Let's get to know Paul through his life, his ministry, his travels. We'll spend a little bit of time tonight looking at the site of Corinth itself so you can feel very oriented and acclimated. So then tomorrow night, we will begin looking at the text in depth, looking at all of these various interesting issues that Paul needs to address for this community. All right, so let's begin. So Paul and the spread of Christianity. Paul is absolutely one of the most important figures in the New Testament. And sadly, as Latter-day Saints, sometimes we just don't spend enough time with Paul. We almost feel like Paul and his letters are for Protestant Christians, right? Evangelical Christians, who, by the way, know Paul a heck of a lot better than Latter-day Saints do. We know the Book of Mormon quite well, and there's a couple Gospels we know all right as well, but we just don't spend enough time with Paul. Paul, though, is a fascinating figure when it comes to the spread of Christianity. We are talking about somebody who spends maybe up to 20 years of his life traveling all over the Mediterranean world, all throughout the Roman Empire, going up and down the coasts of Asia Minor, Western Turkey, going in Macedonia and Achaia in Greece, and even sailing to Rome for what seems to be the end of his ministry. So 20 years of traveling throughout the Roman Empire. And what's fascinating about Paul's letters, what you may or may not recognize when you read the New Testament, is that Paul's letters are actually our earliest surviving Christian literature. Paul's letters were written well before the Gospels, even a few decades before anyone started writing down the stories of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and eventually John. So what that means is, because Paul's letters are the earliest surviving texts from the New Testament, that means that when we read Paul talking about something, talking about Christian theology, reflecting on questions like, why did Jesus have to die? Or what happens when we die? How are humans saved or justified? We are reading the earliest surviving attempts to articulate the Christian message. That's pretty remarkable. Sometimes we take that for granted. We also need to remember that when we're reading Paul's letters and he's describing house churches and worship practices and struggles and debates and leadership structures and all sorts of community dynamics, we are getting our first surviving glimpses of insights into what it's like to be Christian in the first century. And so for all of these reasons, it is really hard to overstate how valuable Paul is for the spread of Christianity, for the establishment of Christian theology, for laying out a blueprint of what it looks like to live as a Christian in a non-Christian world like the Roman Empire. Paul, in fact, is so significant in the establishment, the spreading of early Christianity, that some scholars today have a really interesting debate as to whether or not we could actually call Paul the founder of Christianity. I mean, that sounds really odd, because naturally you'd think of Jesus as the founder of Christianity, and to be sure, that's got to be true. But the good question remains, would the message of Jesus ever gotten out of the Galilee if it wasn't for somebody like Paul? Someone who had the gifts and the talents and the background and the stubbornness and the zeal to literally travel the Roman Empire for 20 years, establishing networks of Christian house churches throughout the Roman world. It really is a good question. So let's go ahead and take a look at Paul. Let's get to know him as a thinker, as a writer, as a minister, and then that will hopefully set us up nicely to look at his writings starting tomorrow. Okay, so let's talk about sources that we have for Paul. How do we get to know Paul? How do we know anything about this fascinating thinker, writer, and early missionary? Well, we actually have two sets of sources in the New Testament that can tell us about Paul's life and ministry. Both sets of sources have their strengths and their limitations. And for the sake of scriptural literacy, right, knowing our New Testament better, it might be worth noting these sources with their strengths and limitations. Starting with what's the latest source, the book of Acts. So as you probably know, in Sunday school, where we've just recently finished the book of Acts. As you know, the book of Acts is the only book in the New Testament that tells a narrative history of Paul's conversion, of his, what we sometimes call his 3 missionary journeys, of his final journey to Rome. And so as such, the book of Acts is an indispensable source for sketching out the basics of how Paul's life and ministry operated. But the limitation on Acts, though, is, number one, it is a second-hand report. Okay, so the book of Acts was not written by Paul. There are only, I think, 3 moments in the book of Acts where the author of Acts interjects a we passage, meaning there might have been at least 3 moments in the book where the author joined with Paul. That's possible. Okay, but other than that, For the most part, this is a secondhand account. This does not reflect Paul's own thinking, and it's a quite late secondhand account. Scholars debate when the Gospel of Luke and the part 2, the book of Acts, were written. We don't know for sure, but it's very possible that it could be as late as the 90s or 80s or 90s, maybe even around the year 100. We don't know, but it's quite late, and it's a secondhand report. But having said that, Acts is invaluable for sketching out the basic historical structure of Paul's life and ministry. So the second set of sources, though, is, of course, the letters of Paul himself. Now, this is obviously indispensable because this is a first-hand account of Paul's thought, of Paul's insights, of his encouragements, his teachings. Having said that, Paul's letters lack narrative detail. He just does not tell a lot of stories about himself. He tends to jump right to the theology or right to the his perspectives on how to live as a Christian in these Greco-Roman cities. So between these two accounts, or between these two sources, first-hand letters that lack narrative detail and a later second-hand account of his historical life and ministry, that's what we have to work with. And we often have to triangulate those sources to try to fill out our understanding of who Paul is. They're both valuable, but we should also note the limitations of both. I really feel like a really cool part of scriptural literacy, of New Testament literacy, is knowing what sources say what. So when it comes to the life of Paul, let's take a few minutes and just look at those two sources side by side and say, what does Acts tell us about his life and background? And what do his letters tell us? Often they agree. Sometimes they don't. And that's okay, right? We would expect those divergences given the nature of the sources. But let's take a look at what these two sets of sources can tell us about this fascinating and inspiring teacher of Jesus. Okay, let's look at his background. What do we know about who Paul is and what his background is? The answer is, well, it kind of depends on which source you're reading. If we look at the Acts of the Apostles first, right, that later secondhand telling of the historical life of Paul, here is what Acts tells us. Acts tells us, number one, that Paul actually is a Roman citizen from a Greek city called Tarsus. Now, that's really interesting on two levels. Number one is Roman citizenship was not very common, especially among Jewish and Christian circles. There were some Judeans who had Roman citizenship, but not many. Paul and Paul's family is one of them. Unfortunately, Acts does not tell us how Paul got citizenship. How did he become a Roman citizen with all of the privileges that come with that status? The answer is, we just don't know. Did his family... was it his family granted citizenship under his father, his grandfather? Well, we just don't know. But we do know from Acts that Paul is a Roman citizen who does come from Tarsus. If you can see the maps, I actually can't, so this podium is not very well positioned. I'm assuming you can see the maps. If you look at the map, you can notice that Tarsus is in the southeast corner of Turkey. And in the first century, Tarsus was a Greek-speaking university town, meaning the place that Paul grew up would have suggested that he was a native Greek speaker who grew up in a university environment. Now, Acts doesn't give us this much detail, but it's natural to assume that in that environment, Paul probably learned the basics of Greek rhetoric, probably became exposed to the basics of Greek philosophy, Greek history and narrative, and that might have informed the way that he was able to teach in a Greek and Roman setting. Kind of interesting to think about that detail from the book of Acts. So here we have someone who's got Roman citizenship, possibly even exposure to Greek education, but religiously, of course, he's Jewish. Ethnically, he's Judean. Religiously, he actually belongs to the sect of the Pharisees, according to Acts, which means that at some point in his life, probably early on, maybe as a teenager, maybe in his early 20s, Paul would have come down from Tarsus to Jerusalem to study at the feet of who Acts identifies as one of the great Pharisaic teachers of first century Judaism, named Rabbi Gamaliel. We read about this in Acts chapter 5, which means that Paul not only is a native Greek speaker who has probable exposure to Greek education, but he's also a very excited, he describes himself as zealous Pharisaic Jew who knows Torah because he's learned it from one of the great Pharisaic rabbis of the first century. And he acknowledges, at least in the Acts narrative, that as a very zealous Pharisee, Paul was actually a persecutor of Jesus' followers. He was absolutely convinced that the Jesus movement represented a heresy within Judaism, and it was a heresy that needed to be stomped out in order to please the God of Israel. You can see a kind of a summary of some of this in the way Acts describes Paul in Acts 22, verse 3. I am verily a man who am Jewish, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia. That's the province in southeast Turkey. And yet I was brought up in this city, meaning Jerusalem, at the feet of Rabbi Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, the law of the fathers, and was zealous towards God. That passage reflects a lot about how Acts views the person of Paul and his background. Now, if we shift over to Paul's own letters, you'll notice that there's a lot of similarity, some things that are not included in Paul's letters, and some additional things that are. For example, in Paul's own letters, which give very few biographical details, he does say he was a Pharisaic Jew, right? So he acknowledges his Jewish ethnicity. He even describes himself as being born into the tribe of Benjamin, right? But religiously, his sectarian affiliation is as a Pharisee, student of Torah, and we read this in Galatians as well. You have heard of my conversion in time past of the Jewish religion, and how beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it. So he freely acknowledges that he was, in fact, a persecutor of the Jesus movement, seeing it as a heresy that needed to be stomped out. But you'll notice in his letters, he never does mention his Roman citizenship. And so there are a few interesting perspectives that our two sources suggest. Okay, so what else can we say about Paul's background? Well, I think his name is interesting, both his Jewish name and the name by which he's most commonly referred to as Paul. And there are some interesting early traditions about Paul that float around in early Christianity. So what can we say about his name? Well, as we know from the book of Acts, his Jewish name was Saul. His Hebrew name was Saul, which probably reflects the fact that, as he said, he was born into the tribe of Benjamin. Saul, of course, was a Benjaminite king, the first king of the United Monarchy. So that does give us a little bit of insight into just his own personal sense, his own personal self-perception. But then, throughout most of the narratives, throughout most of the New Testament literature, we in fact refer to him by a Latin name of Paul or Paulus. And the reality is, we actually don't know where that name comes from. There's nothing explicit in the New Testament that describes why the names shift. Paul clearly is a Latin name, leaving speculations. Is this a Roman family name? Possible. Right? Or is it a nickname? Some scholars have argued that the word Paulus actually comes from the nickname of short stuff, little, round, stubby, or, like a little short guy. Is it possible that Paul actually was, in fact, a little bit on the short side and had that kind of feistiness to him? That's actually not impossible. That's exactly how early Christian traditions describe him. One of my favorite texts, apocryphal text, meaning a text that was written after the time of the New Testament, did not make it into the New Testament, but that describes some traditions about Paul, is a book called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. And in that particular book, the author describes Paul as a man small in size, right? There's your short stuff, or your little stubby, right? Short, small in size. He's bald-headed. He's got crooked thighs, which means there's a tradition that he was bow-legged, so he might have had a bit of an awkward frame and an awkward walk to him. But he was well-built and stocky, with eyebrows meeting, a rather long nose, full of grace, and sometimes he seemed like a man. Sometimes his humanness was really, really clear, but other times he looked like he had the countenance of an angel. That is an early Christian tradition of Paul's appearance, about his personality, his mannerisms, and if any of that sounds familiar to you, it's because Joseph Smith actually read the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And so when Joseph Smith describes Paul, sometimes we've speculated, is it because Joseph's like hanging out with Paul? Is that how he knew? Or is it because he was reading the Acts of Paul and Thecla? I think the latter is probably more likely, but who knows? Maybe Joseph Smith and Paul are hanging out. But in any case, this is basically what we can say from our various sources about Paul's background. In short, Paul was, a little bit of a pun there. In short, Paul was extremely uniquely positioned, right, in terms of Roman citizenship, Greek language and education and rhetoric, Torah scholarship and Hebrew, and in close familiarity with Jewish tradition and Jewish scripture reading. He is stubborn, he's zealous, he's brilliant, and it's almost like he was just the kind of person that God needed to perform a real miracle in what Paul was being asked to do. So what is it then that Paul was being asked to do? Let's now turn to Paul's calling. Sometimes we call this his conversion. Let's look at Paul's calling and his own sense of mission. So he already acknowledged in his letters and in Acts that he was a zealous persecutor of the Jesus movement. He was a Pharisee who saw the Jesus movement as a heresy that needed to be wiped out. But at some point, he has a dramatic change. Okay, he never stops being Jewish, which is why today we don't usually refer to it as his conversion anymore. It's not like he converted from Judaism to Christianity. That language doesn't quite make sense yet in the first century. So today scholars often talk about his calling. He remains Jewish, right? He's ethnically Jewish. He's going to be a practicing Jew throughout his life. He'll work his practicing Jewishness into his theology throughout his life. But something happens as a relatively young man that changes his perspective within Judaism. So what was that calling and what was his sense of mission? Well, the two sets of sources tell generally similar pictures. Let's take a quick look at both, starting with Acts. Acts tells us the most famous story of how Paul was on the road from Jerusalem up to Damascus in Syria. And while he was on that journey, literally, according to Acts, with a letter in hand from the Jerusalem high priest to stomp out the Christian heresy, to find Jesus followers in Damascus and to root them out. Paul has a vision of Jesus, an account that's told 3 different times in the book of Acts, each telling has a few slightly different narrative details, so they are all worth spending time with to look at those different perspectives. But according to Acts, Paul has a vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus, and that he comes away from that vision with a sense of calling, meaning that not only has Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, called him to stop persecuting the followers of Jesus, but in fact to take that entire package that Paul is, the brilliance, the stubbornness, the zeal, and turn it, in fact, to preaching Jesus among non-Jews. A call to bring the gospel message of Jesus and the covenants of Israel to those who are not ethnically born as Judeans. Now, you and I don't usually bat an eye at that because we are living in a world 2,000 years later where, of course, we know that the message of Jesus is universal, that the salvation that Jesus has to offer is for all humanity. But don't forget that when Paul is having this experience, I don't know, mid to late 30s AD, maybe, when he's having this experience, Christianity, by definition, is a Jewish sect. Jews who have found the Jewish Messiah, who have come to save the Jewish people. And if you want to join the Jesus movement, but you're not Jewish, you're Gentile, then you can, but what do you have to do first? You have to convert to Judaism first, right? So, which means you've got to start keeping kosher. You've got to start keeping Pentateuchal Sabbath law. And if you're a dude, here's the knife, the sign of the covenant, it's circumcision, right? So obviously there are some difficult steps to take if you were a non-Jew wanting to become a Jesus follower in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and through the mid-1st century. In other words, it was an ethnically based religious movement still. Okay, so the idea that we now take for granted that the message of Jesus is actually universal, that it transcends ethnic boundaries, that is an innovation that Paul comes away from his vision feeling called to preach. And as you can imagine, that did not come lightly to many of his co-religionists. Not only did he, now become a Jesus follower, which brought with a lot of suspicion. Wait a second, you were literally coming to kill us, and now you're joining us. But you want to do what exactly? You want to now bring the message of Jesus to who? Right? So Paul begins his life as a Jesus follower with an immense amount of controversy. But he comes away from that visionary experience convinced that Jesus has personally called him to bring the good news to non-Jews. This does not mean that he would have seen himself as starting a new religion. Almost certainly what it means is that he saw himself as fulfilling the mission or the visions of Isaiah chapters 56 through 66, what scholars sometimes refer to as third Isaiah, What's the message of 3rd Isaiah 56 through 66? It is that the day will come when the Israelite community will not retract and become more exclusive. But 3rd Isaiah proclaims that the day will come, in fact, at the end times, the day will come when that tent that is Israel will actually expand and include all sorts of previously excluded groups, previously marginalized peoples, and that will include Gentiles. So Paul sees himself, it seems, as some other Christians do too, as initiating the fulfillment of that 3rd Isaiah vision, picking up the tent pegs of the camp of Israel and expanding those tents to include non-Jews and bring them into the fold. This is how the book of Acts portrays Paul's calling and his sense of mission. And I could have put up, a dozen passages here. Here's just a few quick representative samples. Acts chapter 9, when Paul is first blinded by his encounter with Jesus and shows up literally on the doorstep of Ananias, this wonderful man who's leading a house church in Damascus. And Ananias says, what do I do with this guy? And that's when Jesus says, you will take him in, you'll wash him off, and you will lead him on his first steps in being a Jesus follower. And there's Ananias going, what? Why is that? Because Jesus says, he, meaning Paul, is an instrument that I have chosen. He is that uniquely positioned package of talent and skills and zeal and stubbornness. I need him to proclaim my name before non-Jews and kings and before the people of Israel. Later on, Paul will describe that in a similar way, where Jesus tells him, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And all of this seems, if you look at the book of Acts in context, seems to be the author's way of saying that Jesus' injunction in chapter 1, that you, my disciples, will start bearing witness of me in Jerusalem, then in Judea and Samaria, and finally in all the ends of the earth. Right? That's Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where the resurrected Jesus seems to be kind of outlining the book. According to the author of Acts, Paul is the fulfillment of bearing Jesus' name to the ends of the earth. That's probably why the entire second half of Acts is almost completely dedicated to Paul's preaching of Jesus throughout the Roman world, ending up in Rome itself. So that's Acts' sense of Paul's calling and his own self-perception, and his own letters give a similar picture. As far as I can tell, his own letters never do directly describe the experience on the road to Damascus, but what his letters do describe is that he received a revelation of Jesus, that God revealed Jesus to him or in him, and with that same emphasis, that God revealed Jesus to me so that I can bring Gentiles into the community of Israel, just like 3rd Isaiah said would one day happen. You can read about this in Galatians 1, a brief biographical note, self-biographical note. I guess autobiographical. Galatians 1, sorry, it's a little late. There comes a point where it's late enough in the day where I don't think you're accountable for anything you actually say. So I think we're getting to that point now. Okay, here's Galatians chapter 1. But when God, Paul personally says, God had set me apart. He even upon self-reflection thinks before I was born, and he called me through his grace. He was pleased to reveal his son in me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. Then after 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem, talked to leaders of the church, the Jewish Christian movement there, and they saw indeed that I had been entrusted by God with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just like Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised. So Paul sees himself as Peter's counterpart in a way, that Peter was led by God to preach to Jews, and I am led by God to preach to non-Jews. That's how he sees himself. So with that calling and sense of mission from both Acts and his own letters, we now get to watch Paul journey for, it's hard to know how many years, 15 to 20 maybe, throughout the entire eastern half of the Roman Empire. I know that we have all these cool Bible maps in the back of our quads. Actually, first of all, I don't know if anyone actually still carries the quad, but we do have these cool Bible maps, right? We don't look at them very often. Spend some time actually looking at the map that color codes Paul's journeys over a 15 to 20 year period. It's pretty remarkable. It's pretty inspiring. Sometimes we as readers break it up into 3 missions. I don't know if Paul would have done that. I think if you were to go get a falafel with Paul sometime and just say, hey, how many missions were you on? He'd probably just say, what do you mean? What do you mean? I've been a missionary nonstop for 15 years. So I think that's a convenient way for us to break it up. But based on the color coding here, you can see that he initially starts off leaving from Antioch, going through Cyprus, up through central Turkey and back, and then down to Jerusalem. On a second mission, you can see, what's that in purple, I guess? Second mission, you see him go up the coast, the eastern Mediterranean coast, through central Turkey, all the way up to Macedonia, and is taking his journeys down towards Greece, towards Achaia, all the way to Corinth, back to Asia Minor, sailing back to Caesarea, and then finally on the third mission, going back through Asia Minor again, back through Greece again, back to Jerusalem, until finally he gets on a grain ship and takes his final journey all the way to the heart of the Roman Empire in the city of Rome. And that, of course, all is the historical narrative of the book of Acts. So a pretty remarkable series of events in his travels and preaching. Just looking at the time here, 8:05. Okay, yeah, we're doing all right. All right, so what can we say as we're trying to get to know Paul and his missionary journeys? Well, number one, if you look at that map and you see actually where he was traveling and his various journeys, you will notice that Paul is definitely taking advantage of a concept that we sometimes call the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. The Pax Romana is a propaganda campaign and an government infrastructure campaign initiated by the Roman Empire to try to not only unify the empire, but to create military infrastructure throughout the empire in order to maintain control of an expanding empire. Of course, you need the presence and the mobility of Roman legions. So the Roman emperors started laying miles and miles, hundreds and thousands of miles of Roman road all over the Mediterranean world to facilitate Roman traffic, Roman military traffic. But of course, what that did, according to the propaganda, is create a peace, right? We can now maintain peace. And that's obviously a very debatable concept. But the infrastructure of the Pax Romana, the building of these roads and travel facilities that were meant to facilitate the movement of the Roman armies, also ended up facilitating trade and travel. And that's exactly what Paul used to make his journeys through Asia Minor, through Greece, and all the way out to Rome. Half the time, he's probably just hitting the Roman road. Right? He's got his horse, he's got his entourage of other missionary companions, fellow laborers, and they're just taking the Roman road from Roman city to Roman city to Roman city, taking advantage of that infrastructure. Along the way, of course, he is also preaching to Jews. According to the book of Acts, Paul had a bit of an MO, right? A bit of a way that he tended to proceed in his missionary journeys. Once Paul and his fellow laborers would hit the Roman road and they'd appear into the next city somewhere in the east, it seems like, according to Acts, that the first thing he would do is, in fact, find the local synagogue, meaning that Paul is not only taking advantage of the Roman road network, but he's also taking advantage of the network of diaspora Jewish synagogues that existed throughout the Roman world. You probably are aware that Jews did not only live in Judea, but at some point in the Hellenistic and early Roman period, Jewish communities started leaving Judea, or Jewish families and small communities started leaving Judea and settling in other cities of the Roman Empire. Now, in Judea, Jews would have been the ethnic majority and the religious majority. But in these cities throughout the Roman Empire, Judeans would have been an ethnic minority group, a cultural and religious minority group who in some cases blended in fine and in other cases did not blend in so well. But in any one of these communities of minority Jews, of diaspora Jews, they would have built a synagogue. And according to the book of Acts, when Paul would go on the Roman road, appear in a Roman city, the first thing he would do was find the local diaspora synagogue. He would seek out the minority group, right, of Judeans, find their gathering place, and on Sabbath would visit with them, would go to the synagogue services, would read Torah with them. And at the end of the Torah reading, he would usually stand up, introduce himself, say, "Hey, I'm Paul. Paul, how are you? Right? You guys ever heard of Jesus?" And then he starts teaching Jesus the Messiah, which of course raises a ruckus. In some cases, local Judeans and these diaspora communities were very interested in what Paul was proclaiming. In other cases, they were not. Two categories of synagogue worshipers who did seem to frequently resonate with Paul's message are two categories of Gentiles who found themselves sympathetic to Judaism. In these different diaspora communities, there seems to have been Gentiles who were called proselytes. These were Gentiles who seemed to have been so attracted to the God of Israel, so attracted to Jewish lifestyles and customs and scripture and traditions, that they went through a full conversion process. So if we read the word proselyte in the book of Acts, we're talking about someone who's not ethnically Jewish, but who is fully converted, who are fully keeping Sabbath, kosher, and if they're a dude, they've been circumcised. A second category of Gentiles who were part of these synagogue networks were called God-fearers in the book of Acts. God-fearers are Gentiles who are also interested in the God of Judea, maybe feel to revere the God of Judea, the God of Israel, but for probably obvious reasons, don't feel like they can fully convert. And so they just kind of hang out. Well, both of these two categories, proselytes and especially God-fearers, were particularly receptive to Paul's missions when he would go to these cities, preach in this local synagogue, create a division in the crowd. It was often God-fearers, Gentiles, who were interested in the God of Israel, had not yet fully converted, who found themselves drawn to Paul and say, hey, tell us more about Jesus and about a way to salvation that does not require kosher laws or Sabbath laws or circumcision laws. Anyway, so it's really interesting. And it's often in the book of Acts, after he would preach in these diaspora Jewish synagogues, that then he would say, now I'm going to turn to the Gentiles. Right now, I'm going to go to the marketplace. Now I'm going to go to the local philosophical school. Now I'm going to go to these other places and talk directly to non-Jews and try to convince them that they should abandon their former ways, their ancestral traditions, and follow Jesus, the Judean Messiah. Now, preaching to Gentiles in these cities would have been particularly difficult. And we know from Paul's letters and the book of Acts that it was a real struggle, partially because in these Greco-Roman cities, you had a concept that we sometimes call the Pax Deorum, or the peace of the gods. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that each city that Paul would have visited, where you've got a Greek or a Roman majority, the idea is that each city has a member of the Greco-Roman pantheon, right? A god or a goddess in the Greco-Roman pantheon as their patron deity. And that to keep the favor of the patron deity of that city, whether it be Ephesus or Rome or Athens, that you have to offer certain sacrifices to that deity. You have to participate in certain festivals honoring that deity. Essentially, what is Paul asking people to do? To give that up, to give up their family traditions, their family religious life, and to basically turn their back on their communities in a way that can have dramatic social consequences. In fact, we know that this is kind of how his message worked, because in his earliest surviving letter, if Paul's letters as a whole are the earliest surviving New Testament texts, pretty random, but 1 Thessalonians seems to be the first. Okay, and in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul actually seems to paraphrase what his stump speech was, right? When he would go to the marketplace in a downtown part of a city, it seems like his message was this. Number one, to the non-Jews, to Greeks and Romans, number one, I am calling you to turn from your Greco-Roman idols, meaning abandon this whole practice of the Pax Deorum, to worship the true and living God. And that is the God of Judea. Yeah, that backwater province in the eastern part of the empire. Yeah, the God of Judea, that's the only God that actually exists. So give up your gods, worship the God of Judea. And the second half of the missionary speech is, oh, and by the way, the God of Judea has a son. The God of Judea's son, his name is Jesus. And right now we are anxiously waiting for Jesus to come to save us from an approaching wrath. See, Paul's an apocalyptic preacher. Paul believes that they are literally on the end, or on the precipice of the end times. And by the way, he comes by that honestly. What was Jesus's very final sermon that he gives to his disciples? The apocalyptic discourse, the sermon about the coming of the Son of Man. But no person knows the day or the hour. The angels don't know. The Son doesn't even know, Jesus says. So yeah, Paul's coming by it honestly. He knows the second coming is happening. He just doesn't know when. Just like all of us, he assumes it's going to be soon. And so he's proclaiming to these Gentiles, abandon your ancestral deities, turn from those Greco-Roman gods, worship the true and living God, the God of Judea, and wait for the return of the Son of the Judean God to save us from a coming wrath. That seems to have been Paul's message. And it's really interesting to watch various Gentiles respond to that or not. And those who did, of course, experience a remarkable amount of social dislocation. The amount of sacrifice that it would have taken to follow Paul's message, to leave their family, resulted in Gentiles who were quite marginalized often from their families and from their former networks of associations, which led Paul in his earliest letters to start, maybe for the first time, using metaphors of a new family. We're your family now, the family of believers, the household of faith, a way of forging community identity to those who were experiencing social dislocation because of everything they had to leave to follow Paul. So one of Paul's efforts in his letters is to try to create that new community identity to help overcome the social dislocation that would have come from following Paul. The other part of his letters, of course, is to try now to teach these people what it looks like to be a Christian in a sometimes hostile cultural environment. What does it mean to live like a Christian in a Greek city? What does it mean to follow a Christian lifestyle in anxious anticipation of the second coming? Well, this is the stuff of his letters. This is what Paul is talking about in 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, and in 1 Corinthians. Now, looking at the time, time is getting away from us a little quickly. So I am going to skip. Maybe we can talk more about this tomorrow. I was going to do a little bit of a survey, an overview, a summary of what the house churches looked like. Once someone did join the Christian movement, what did the Pauline house churches look like? We'll talk about that later. The short is they're meeting in houses, a very wide diversity of ethnic, socioeconomic classes are all mixing together. Paul is definitely trying to create a movement in these house churches that are breaking down dividing walls. There's no longer Jew or Greek, no longer slave or free, no longer even male or female. All are one in Christ Jesus, trying to break down traditional boundaries in the Roman world. And in these gatherings, as we'll see in the next couple weeks, in the next couple days, the next couple days, that these house church gatherings were quite charismatic and fascinating in the way that they worship. But we'll punt that till tomorrow. Okay, so now in our final 15 minutes, let's now turn to Corinth itself. I hope that what we've done, albeit at lightning quick speed, I recognize, is I hope that we've painted a helpful portrait of who Paul is, his background, his calling, his sense of mission, his missionary efforts, the logistics of how he traveled and preached, and his ideologies. But what we now want to do is let's now focus more particularly on his travels to Corinth, the topic of this particular series. So Corinth is a Greek city that first shows up in Paul's missions on what we sometimes call his second missionary journey. This is the one, if you follow the red line there, and you can see the years, roughly 49 through 52 AD. After Paul goes through central Turkey, northern Greece, travels through Macedonia, comes down through Athens, and eventually makes his way over to Corinth, and then back again. That is where Corinth first shows up in Paul's journey. It's a place where he's going to spend, according to Acts, a year and a half establishing house churches and preaching out of a tent-making shop, apparently. We'll look at that here in a moment. But that's where Corinth hits the map for Paul. This year and a half stay as part of his so-called second missionary journey. So what do we know about Corinth that can help us better read his letters, his correspondence to this group of believers in subsequent years? Well, the answer is quite a lot, actually. Corinth is very well known through ancient historical sources, ancient literary sources, and it's well known through archaeological excavation. Here are a few very basic observations that we can make about Corinth that I think will be helpful as you start thinking about reading or maybe teaching 1 Corinthians in the coming weeks. Okay, number one, if you'll notice where Corinth is located, it's here on what's called the Peloponnese, right? That part that kind of juts out from mainland Greece, and it's located right along an isthmus that connects mainland Greece with the Peloponnese, which means Corinth is a thriving port city. Now, the reason why it's a thriving port city is because all of the merchants, all the trade, the economic trade that was going all over the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, found that bringing large cargo ships full of, grain or oil or wine or statuary or whatever, large cargo ships, if they sailed too far into the center of the Mediterranean Sea, were often at risk of capsizing, getting caught in a storm. Typically, you'd want to kind of hug the coastlines with your ships to make sure that you don't lose your cargo or capsize in a storm or something like that. But if you're hoping to trade between Asia Minor, let's say, and let's say up in northern Greece or western Greece or northeastern Italy, it takes a lot of time to travel all the way around the Peloponnese and back. So instead, there was this strategy developed early on in the Hellenistic period that if ships brought their cargo up through the Saronic Gulf, they could actually unload their cargo on the one side of the isthmus, transport their cargo up over land across the isthmus, and load it up on a ship on the other side of the isthmus that would then take it off to sell. So in other words, the isthmus that Corinth is connected to, that connects mainland Greece with the Peloponnese, became a major shipping zone overland, if that makes sense. And while the sailors of those ships were waiting for the goods to be transported overland, where do they go? Well, they go to the Las Vegas of ancient Greece. They go to Corinth. And that's exactly why Corinth, because of its location, its control over the Isthmian tradeways, why it became so prosperous, like extremely wealthy. Also, the fact that nearby are these Pan-Hellenic games that brought pilgrims every few years to the region. Corinth was a hopping place. It was a place of economic trade, economic boom, games, and so forth. It was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC, refounded as a Roman colony in 44 BC. So by the time of Paul, that economic thriving was back in action. We are talking about an economic boom town that has an enormous amount of ethnic diversity. So in Paul's Corinth, we would have seen Greeks, Romans, Syrians, Egyptians, Judeans, a lot of multicultural transients happening here in Corinth. And we would have seen a lot of economic diversity. Because of its status as this thriving port town, there was a wealthy upper class in Corinth, Romanized elites. There were also transient classes, people coming in and out, a lot of sailors coming in and out of town. And there were lower working classes as well. So there's ethnic diversity, economic diversity. All of this is turning out to be very important, actually, because when we get to the letter of 1 Corinthians, you will begin to see all of these dynamics in play in Paul's conversation about how do you live as a Christian in a Greek city like this. Okay, so keep your eye on that. We'll come back to it tomorrow. What else can we say about Corinth? Well, Corinth has been extensively excavated. Corinth, we know from archaeological excavations, looking at the time here, we know that it has a large cardo. You can still visit Corinth today. Not all of these ruins date to the time of Paul, but it gives us a sense of what this city would have been like in the first century. There would have been a paved cardo, a main street. There would have had a colonnade supporting shaded walkways. And in those shaded walkways would have been market stalls. Right? So a lot of downtown business and marketplaces. At one end of the cardo, there would have been a basilica with a bema, a raised platform for judicial hearings or royal audiences. There would have been a theater there, and there would have been residential areas, lots of homes, both elite and non-elite homes in Corinth. Based on the excavations, you can actually note kind of where these institutions are, where the main streets are, where the marketplaces are, the temples, the basilicas, even the theater. Here's a couple artistic reconstructions that just give you a sense of what this city would have been like. I enjoy this one. It doesn't show us the main part of downtown, but it does show us the location of Corinth. You see the Gulf of Corinth there. The Saronic Gulf would have been off to our right. And you can see the ships coming in and out at the isthmus, right? So it gives you a nice sense of the proximity of this site with that shipping that made this city so prosperous. And I do like this artistic reconstruction because it does remind us that there's a lot of residential housing, right, and along the sides of the city, meaning any one of those could have been a house church. We don't know for sure, but there were several house churches in Corinth, several homes that were opened up to believers in Jesus to gather. And this artistic reconstruction just reminds us of what it would have been like to meet in these house churches in such close proximity to a thriving downtown with the paved streets, the marketplaces, the basilicas, the platform, the bema for civic court and litigation, the theater that could have seated 15,000 people to take in Greek plays and dramas, which may even have a reference to a character that Paul would have known, Erastus, right? That's kind of cool. Enough time for that, though. Here's another cool reconstruction of that. Now, the other thing that we know from archaeological excavations and ancient literary sources is that Corinth, of course, as a Greco-Roman city, had several temples as central to its religious landscape. We have the Temple of Apollo, the Temple of Asclepius, the healing god, and the Temple of Aphrodite, a fertility goddess, right? A goddess of love. The latter, the Temple of Aphrodite, is up on what's called the Acrocorinth. That's the high mountain behind it. That was the Acropolis of the city. And right at the top of the Acropolis was this Temple of Aphrodite. There's the Temple of Apollo. The Temple of Aphrodite, here it is reconstruction. I think that this reconstruction is from Assassin's Creed. I don't know, take that for what it's worth, but it's a pretty cool reconstruction. Just giving us a sense of what it would have been like to have the Temple of Aphrodite crowning the Acrocorinth, the Acropolis of the city. Now, the fact that the Temple of Aphrodite is in fact the most prominently positioned temple, does give Corinth a bit of a reputation. The first century geographer Strabo, for example, describes how the Temple of Aphrodite at Corinth was so rich that it owned more than 1,000 temple slaves. Read prostitutes. Courtesans, both men and women, dedicated to the goddess. And therefore, it was also on account of these women that the city was crowded with people and grew rich. For instance, the ship's captains freely squandered their money, and hence the proverb, not for every person is the voyage to Corinth. Right? In other words, Corinth had a reputation for a high amount of prostitution, possibly connected with the Temple of Aphrodite and the 1,000 sacred slaves that would have serviced her cult there. Meaning, Corinth, it's the Las Vegas of the Greek world. I mean, this is a place where sailors are coming in and out, economic diversity, ethnic diversity. It's a really transient, wealthy place in a lot of ways, and it had a reputation for being just like that, which, by the way, reminds us, as we're reading 1 Corinthians, to keep an eye on Paul's concern of what it looks like to live as a Christian in a Greek city like this. Okay, we don't have time for this. Some of you will probably be grateful. I was going to talk about prostitution at Corinth and genitalia at the Asclepion, but maybe we'll save that gem for another conversation later in the week. Looking at the time, though, let's now turn back to Acts. So what did Paul do in Corinth? Okay, well, Acts tells us that when Paul left Athens, he pulls into he walks over the isthmus and settles down in Corinth for 18 months. A year and a half. During that 18-month period, early on, apparently, he became acquainted with a Jewish couple named Aquila and Priscilla. And it turns out that Aquila and Priscilla are not only Jewish, but they're sympathetic to the Jesus movement. And early on, they become friends and colleagues. In fact, because Aquila and Priscilla are tent makers, which Acts tells us was also Paul's trade, that's very possible that's how they met. Like, Paul pulls into Corinth and needs some work, finds some local Jewish tent makers or leather workers and says, can I work with you? And next thing you know, they form a relationship. They even form a collaboration. And it's very possible that for the year and a half that Paul's in Corinth, literally doing, leather working and tent making, that he's using the workshop as the place to preach Jesus. Clients would come in, hey, I need you to fix these sandals. And Paul's like, oh, great, yeah, have a seat. It'll just take a few minutes. Hey, so great. Hey, have you ever heard of Jesus? He's like, preaching Jesus out of the tent making shops. And as a result, after a year and a half, Paul now has several house churches in Corinth of Jews, God-fearers, Gentile believers. And these are going to be the people that will eventually be the audience of 1 Corinthians. Here's a kind of a fun artistic imagination of Paul and maybe Aquila. They're working on tents together and talking about Jesus and maybe hosting potential people who are interested coming in there. Okay. Well, then finally, at the end of Acts, I know we're almost out of time, but Acts 18 concludes the story of Paul in Corinth by telling us that at the end of this year and a half, eventually a local synagogue leader named Sosthenes does become frustrated with Paul, actually accuses Paul of violating law. He didn't really specify what law Paul had violated, and brings Paul up before the local magistrate named Gallio for the violation of law. Once Gallio, though, finds out that Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, thought that Paul had violated Jewish Torah, meaning Jewish law. He's like, wait a second, so he didn't violate Roman law? Well, then I don't care. So Gallio lets Paul go and actually has Sosthenes beaten. And at that point, though, Paul decides that it is time to head out. And that's how that goes. Okay, so we only have 1 minute left, which is probably not enough, but I'll just do my best. So in conclusion, then, I hope that we have not only painted a nice picture of Paul's background and his experience in Corinth, but now we get to turn our gaze towards the letter of 1 Corinthians. Okay, as far as we know, 1 Corinthians was probably written in the mid-50s, 56 to 57, by Paul and Sosthenes when they're on their quote-unquote third mission in Ephesus. And Paul is writing to these mostly Gentile house churches that have now been established during his time in Corinth, these socially and economically and ethnically diverse Jesus followers. The circumstance, which we'll have to look at a little bit more tomorrow, is basically that he gets a letter from one of the local leaders of a house church named Chloe saying, Paul, you have got some problems. These house churches are starting to break down in factionalism. They're starting to debate aspects of Christian living in a Greek city. And they're having doctrinal concerns. As you'd imagine, these are really young converts. Paul, what should we do about all this? And it's these letters, these correspondence letters to Paul saying, Paul, the house churches are starting to have problems, that prompts the writing of 1 Corinthians. I really do think, I have 2 slides left, but just give me a second. So what does 1 Corinthians do? Well, it is a letter that Paul will write trying to address these various issues that are coming to his attention. He needs to address breakdown in unity. He needs to look at factionalism. He needs to talk about problems of behavior. How do you live as a Christian in a Greek city? He has to talk about how do you worship properly in a Greek city. And he has to address some of these doctrinal concerns about, let's actually talk about a physicality to the resurrection and so forth. That's going to be the stuff, the meat, the content of 1 Corinthians. So in the next couple days, what we get to do with that background in place, we now get to turn to 1 Corinthians and look at various themes that appear throughout the letter. And in the process of a careful, close reading of 1 Corinthians, we are going to have a wonderful journey through the social history of early Christianity in a Greek city like Corinth. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the house churches and factionalism, worship, and their charismatic gifts. Thursday, we're going to look at Paul's teaching to the Corinthians on Christian living, right? Morality, marriage, and even dining in a Greco-Roman city. And then Friday, we'll conclude this series by looking at Paul's teachings on the Christian faith, right? Teachings of the cross, teachings of divine versus human wisdom, and his teachings on a physical resurrection. So thank you for joining me tonight. I'm really looking forward to starting this series with you. And with that, we'll see you in 20 minutes for the book of Revelation. Okay, take care.